Griffith Jones is remembered or forgotten as a preacher whose ministry affected many in the Church of England in Wales in what became known as the Awakening, but especially for his circulating schools. These were peripatetic classes in basic literacy for Welsh-speaking people, which led towards renewed confidence in the use of Welsh and aided survival of the language into the present time. There's only room here for a brief outline of the man's career, devoting most time to his manner of dealing with his wealthy supporters, English supporters of his schools. In 1708, when Jones was ordained deacon, Wales was largely a Welsh-speaking populace with an anglicised gentry. 9/10 of its population, which is mostly monoglot Welsh-speaking, estimated at a mere 420,000 people, had been baptised within the established Church of England. Griffith Jones came from a Carmarthenshire farming family of modest means. His father died when Griffith was very young. He suffered from lifelong ailments. Griffith suffered some mostly existing in his mind, in his imagination, but some truly afflicting, like asthma and depression. These recurring troubles affected his unusual character, which combined an obsessive intensity in all his endeavours, a lack of any sense of humour, and an inflexible moralism. But he had a shrewd, intuitive flexibility, a gift of warm friendships, which could never hold a grudge, a persuasive personal charm, an unflagging, selfless devotion, especially to his poor, underprivileged Welsh-speaking countrymen. He was greatly admired by many for his preaching, possessing a priceless gift for speaking pure, elegant Welsh. He seems to have had a naturally scholarly mind and, surprisingly, a gentlemanly grace that was to ease his way later when moving among the landowning and anglicised gentry of West Wales and even fashionable circles in London, Bath and elsewhere. One struggles to understand precisely Griffith Jones's allegiances in a time of social and philosophical flux, without falling into the assumption that present-day labels can be applied to him, such as Methodist or evangelical. In his doctrine and ecclesiology, he developed conservatively from his Anglican roots, and so it is more a hindrance than a help to call him Puritan, despite the coincidences. Similarly, to call him a nationalist suggests some things not true of Jones's love of his people. He was equally a schoolmaster and a parson. To understand Griffith Jones, you've got to remember he's a lifelong schoolmaster. And the title educationist is not incorrect. It rather conveys too much a sense of a theoretician rather than one building his methods conservatively out of practical experience. One is tempted to use a welter of inappropriate popular terms for Griffith Jones: the consummate, astute organiser, publicist, propagandist, fundraiser, or even upwardly mobile networker. Working within the constraints of social conditions, he avoided ideological wrangles and the controversialism of clerics like John Evans of Meidrim, who were looking for a quarrel, but he took cautious advantage of fortuitous opportunities to widen the liberalising projects that gradually formed in his mind, one leading from another. He was a shrewd, indefatigable, constructive innovator, a conservative revolutionary. His mind was that of a lifelong schoolmaster, building steadily, attuned to his pupils, with whom he always kept in step. Briefly, constraints laid upon Wales and its church. The so-called Act of Union of February 1535-6, followed by the Statute of 1542, legally incorporated Wales into the Kingdom of England. The preamble to that act mentioned the naturalisation of all the Welsh as subjects and full beneficiaries of the Tudor state. The contemporary ideal of a mother tongue was included in the preamble, suggesting that Welsh loyalty should not be obstructed by dangerous linguistic diversion. Thomas Cromwell stated the ideal of one harmonious body politic with alarmist exaggeration, because that the people of the same dominion have and do daily use a speech nothing like, nor consonant to the natural mother tongue used within the realm. You'll never guess which mother tongue that is. Cromwell saw national integrity as depending on abolishing this mistrusted anomaly. The so-called mother tongue had exclusively to be English, so the language of the law courts, public business, had to be was restricted to it. I add this, and I just throw this out, and it's put in the handbook. This is the Henrician Acts were part of a contemporary movement in Europe towards national individualism, each sovereign nation having allegedly its own mother tongue. Compare the policy of King Alfonso X of Castile and Leon to impose an official form of Castilian, and more closer home, the Edict of Villers-Cotterêts of King Francis I of France 3.5 years later than Henry VIII's Acts. Close, but actually after. Bilingualism, the insistence on monolingualism, but bilingualism in England, in answer to the notion of English monoglot nationhood, one must mention that England had long been harmoniously multilingual. Latin had been in use since the introduction of Christianity and served fruitfully to stimulate English literature without harm to the sense of national identity. Even the Reformation, with English Bible and prayer book, had not excluded Latin, which continued as a medium of education and scholarship. And French had been much in use in England alongside English from the conquest, even developing a distinct dialect of French, Anglo-Norman. French had official status at court, in parliament, in official documents. The law courts were conducted in French till 1400, and the language continued to be used for legal documents as law French until 1733. And on top of that, there is a noticeable difference of approach taken by the English government to the Norman French dialects used in the Channel Islands, and the use of literary French there in the church as well. So the prejudice, there was a prejudice against the use of Welsh. The anglicised patrician Scotsman Robert Hay Drummond was Bishop of St Asaph, later of Salisbury and Archbishop of York. He publicly expressed a common self-congratulatory prejudice, hoping that people would see it in their best interest to enlarge their views and notions and to unite with the rest of their fellow subjects in language as well as in government. Learning English can be useful, as Griffith Jones said, but it's hard to show how a people can enlarge their views and notions by discarding their accumulated linguistic culture. And it was this Philistine insensitivity that confronted Griffith Jones. But his practical mind perceived that there were avenues for him to follow whilst avoiding any public controversy. So I'm getting closer to Griffith and his work. Every culture depends upon an elite to set standards by example and patronage, not least those of language. But the language course of Henry's Act, King Henry's Act, had come to impair and decapitate Welsh-speaking society. It had created and would continue to create an aspiring landed gentry in Wales whose first language was English, and who were merging furthermore with English ruling circles and often marrying English heiresses. The cultural difference from their distance from their tenants was thus made practically unbridgeable. Geraint Jenkins points out that the loss points out the loss of prestige resulting from this change. Prestige. In terms of patronage, he says, by the gentry, the Welsh language had most certainly lost ground by the Restoration period. And even at this advanced stage, there were many who were still not persuaded that it was a suitable medium for theological controversy or politico-legal protest. Significantly, later in the century, the leading early Welsh Methodistical evangelists, such as Howell Harris and William Williams, even wrote their private correspondence and diaries in English. It as a kind of sign of aspiring, of a literary ambition and of following that standard. Such usage had become, according to Geraint Tudor, a hallmark of sophistication. So, how could a lowly country parson like Griffith Jones be expected to do anything to hinder the cultural downgrade created by these factors? There were lines to follow. Government policy regarding Welsh had been for long contradicting itself in the matter of the Bible and prayer book in the worship of the Church of England. In 1558, the Protestant Constitution of England seemed very precarious. It was important to strengthen Anglican corporate worship and doctrine as a focus of political cohesion and stability. So, contrary to the policy of speeding the demise of Welsh, an Act of Parliament in 1563 ordered the translation of the Book of Common Prayer and the Bible into Welsh. Also, there was a strong argument at the core of the English Reformation, the Protestant emphasis on personal faith and consequent need of an understanding of the Bible's doctrine promoted the demand that worship and teaching should be in a language that the people could understand. The prayer book and the New Testament were published in 1567. In 1588, a whole version of the whole Bible in Welsh was issued with royal approval, the royal arms on the frontispiece, printed by the Queen's printer. Edmund Preece later produced a complete version of the Psalms in meter, 1621, for congregational singing. These provided a foundation upon which Griffith Jones could build from within the establishment. For this, fortuitously, he also had important allies, and notably Sir John Phillips. Sir John Phillips, who was typical but exceptional. Griffith Jones formed an unexpected and exceptional friendship with the wealthiest local magnate, Sir John Phillips, 4th Baronet Phillips of Picton. He was closely connected with the ruling elite, with married connections with the aristocracy, and he fulfilled the role of the loyal leading citizen or subject. In every way, Phillips fulfilled the role envisaged in the Act of Union for justices, commissioners, sheriffs, and all other officers and ministers of the law. The great internal force due to undergird monoglot English predominance. But ironically, Griffith Jones's position and influence in Wales were consolidated because he had support from this very quarter in the person of connection with Sir John Phillips, and hence also with the network or the wider network of pious South Wales gentry. Phillips, the leading West Wales grandee, unlike many others of his rank, also expressed an earnest Anglican piety and followed the new currents of religious life in Wales. He used his wealth and influence as a zealous patron of good causes, including charity schools and Christian literature. Using the right of presentation to benefices, he avoided nepotism and was in everything a careful guardian of what he thought to be the church's best interest. Phillips was one of a close-knit group of other serious-minded gentry in the region, active supporters of the SPCK, such as John Vaughan of Daleslis. It appears that Sir John first took notice of the young Griffith Jones on hearing him preaching as early as 1708, probably at Larne, where Jones had been appointed as a schoolmaster and curate in that year. He promoted Jones and remained an intimate, and I'm quoting here, an intimate and constant friend, brother-in-law and collaborator as an SPCK member. He and Jones both aspired to social benevolence by religious societies and the provision of Christian instruction by charity schools. Sir John founded and financed 22 such schools in Pembrokeshire and some in Carmarthenshire. Jones taught in them from 1708 at the latest, and founded one of such schools in his own parish once he was established at Llanddowror. His influential career in preaching, catechizing, promoting the Welsh Bible and Christian literature, and in education followed Sir John, his patron's ideals. Though in the end, he carried them further. There may be a moment to go on with that particular point. Griffith Jones began a wider publicity for his Welsh language circulating schools in his yearly Welsh Piety. He only began in 1737, the year of Sir John's death, and perhaps this is evidence of his caution in pursuing his defence of the Welsh language. As a regular, waiting until after his death to make it his policy more public. As a regular visitor to Bath, Jones does not seem to have kept aloof, despite the loose behaviour of some of the gentry. It was on his visits there that he built financial support by contact with the sympathetic members of the gentry. This is important, and I can only mention it in a sentence or two. On the 1st of February 1719-20, Margaret Phillips, Sir John's elder sister, married Griffith Jones in St. Peter's Church, Carmarthen. This marriage seems very significant. You might like to discuss this afterwards. I haven't found anyone who particularly agrees with me. I think it's extremely important, significant. An exceptional example of the strong unanimity in Christian piety between these two of such social distance. There was widespread revulsion at the emerging Methodistical movement, also overstepping of the divisions of rank ran counter to strong prejudices concerning order in society. This alliance proves an overriding unity of mind and sympathy affected by the common progressive Christian outlook of Jones and Phillips and others. It seems clear that Jones was accepted into the Phillips family without any sign of reserve, and thus was elevated into the gentry with whom he mingled. But Griffith Jones still had to be cautious towards them when defending his mother tongue and the Welsh piety. And he never played the parvenu. He kept to his position and his work, concentrated on his parishes. And also, besides Margaret Phillips, Madam Bridget Bevan must be mentioned. One can't spend time on her. After Sir John's death in 1737, another member of the West Wales gentry, Bridget Bevan, became his patron and close collaborator. After Griffith Jones's death in 1761, she took over fully and very efficiently the work of maintaining and developing the schools. She was an example of the many strong women connected with the Awakening movement, which led in part to Methodism. These were not inactive adjuncts, but prime influences. And just a little bit about the schools, how they began. A brief mention of the circulating schools. They were an innovating scheme of peripatetic literacy classes, mostly for adults and both sexes, and they were not a diversion from promoting the ideals of the Church of England. They grew out of his regular catechizing in Welsh on the Saturdays, before the monthly communion Sundays, when Jones, according to his own words, discoursed in an easy, familiar, and very serious way about every answer they made, explaining it clearly to their understanding and strongly applying it to their consciences. That sums up Griffith. And he could see now he's doing this in Welsh. And wouldn't it be good if the schooling and the literacy classes could themselves be continued in Welsh? So they grew in this way, beginning in a small exploratory way. In 1731, they grew in number to 37 schools in 1738. Griffith-Jones did not declaratively set out to reform the social and linguistic order within the British state. The prime motive of his labours was to bring biblical knowledge to his people. But alongside there was a subtext of resistance consistent with unaggressive Christianity to the repression of the language and culture. He wrote mildly, for instance, "I must not omit to wipe off one other aspersion our Welsh tongue labours under. It is condemned, but unjustly, as a worthless tongue, affording no knowledge of moment, being no key for any valuable treasure." He promoted the use of the Welsh language in his schools by a deft evasion of the obstacles of English prejudice, or the prejudice of some English people, and of the abiding legal prohibitions to its use in public life. Importantly, he skillfully accomplished this by forming an unexpected new alliance with the very gentry, both Welsh and English, which formed such an obstruction to its survival as a minority language. He brought out the yearly Welsh Piety Report on his work. Jones could not go on indefinitely avoiding the issue of language, but he had to deal with it very, very carefully. Though not all members even of the Welsh gentry could be relied upon to perform their duty of care in social leadership, Griffith-Jones expressed a cautious optimism to win over his English donors to his policy regarding the use of Welsh. There was a precedent of sympathetic English support for the charity school set up by Thomas Gouge in the previous century. Thomas Gouge's Welsh Trust. Gouge had tapped English sympathy towards poverty-stricken Wales. After 1699, the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge directed much of its efforts to help the poor Welsh by charity schools and literature with evident sympathy. But doubts still remained in the minds of English benefactors about the perpetuation of the Welsh language. It was among these kindly Englishmen, so obstinately slow to understand the value of Welsh, that Griffith-Jones charmed some, at least, into protracted, generous financial support for his school and consequently of the Welsh language and literary culture. Almost all of Jones's largest donors were English and had few or no Welsh connections, but who, like other Englishmen in the previous century, had shown sympathy for Wales. Undaunted, Griffith-Jones undertook the unpromising task of persuading these English philanthropists of the value of that strange-sounding language, for his great educational venture. So from 1737, he circulated annually his Welsh piety, a printed report on the progress of his circulating schools. Of the core of his regular lay donors, whose names appeared annually in the Welsh piety, only one was a Welshman, Thomas Jones, an official in the Exchequer Office at Westminster. The rest were disinterested English philanthropists with no imperative obligations to Wales. Like the supporters of Thomas Gouge's Welsh Trust in the previous century, these men had sympathy for the neglected Welsh people. Jones was persuasive in getting donations, but it was his custom to meet the main donors during the annual assemblies at Bath. Their names occur annually, they recur in the Welsh piety. From about 1749, the names of supportive Welsh North Wales clerics also appear in the Welsh piety. So the lead is seems to be from these English people. But by 1749, Griffith seems to have shown that this was a movement that was worth supporting. All this is evidence of Jones's happy ability of making and keeping social contacts, of reassuring other clergymen of his conformist intentions. Gradually, the value of his schools was recognized as reaching the approved goal of strengthening the people's grasp of Christian knowledge. The weight of clerical support further helps to prove the existence of a persisting body of diligent and pious, albeit overlooked clergy in Wales. But this external benevolence could not at once remove the dead weight of unsympathetic Anglicised Welsh gentry. From 1737, the Welsh piety was printed annually, reporting progress of his circulating schools. There was a continued need to maintain the goodwill of his English donors, defending the schools against detractors, and the recurring imputation of there being an engine to promote Methodistical enthusiasm. In a letter of the 11th of October 1739, he tackled, among other misgivings, the objection to the teachings not being in English. Jones forestalled. Now, I hope we're going to see how clever he is in getting around these people. Jones forestalled the complaint by referring to the disagreeable novelty of setting up schools in the Welsh tongue. That these Welsh charity schools are means to continue the use of the Welsh tongue and to keep the natives in ignorance of English. He took a first step to outmaneuver his doubters, who must in fact have still been numerous, by expressing a confidence that the worries had already been answered. They have now pretty well got over such prejudices that we were afraid would be most fatal to them. One begins to see that his lengthy open letter was a tactful and clever defence of the continuing use of Welsh, presenting it as a special case, an argument which in fact still needed to be reinforced. Jones went on subtly to strengthen his case, mentioning the serious objection to dealing with Welsh differently from other domestic languages. It is urged that the Irish is abolishing by means of the charity schools in the Highlands of Scotland and beginning to be so by the same institutions in Ireland, and that the Bishop of Man, that is the famous Thomas Wilson, has found means to bring the Manx into disuse. I don't think that's true. I think Thomas Wilson was a supporter of the Manx language. I'm not saying that Griffith Jones was misleading. I think that he had that impression. And why must the king's subjects in Wales be the only persons with whom little or no pains are taken to make them learn the English tongue? Thus, with an innocent disingenuousness, Jones set out to undermine the common assumption of a need of uniformity in language. He managed his argument deftly, defending the policy of respecting Welsh while mildly refraining from directly questioning the assumed superiority of English. With cunning and amusing charm, he turned the argument round against the reactionaries. His bland overture was to deny any preoccupation with perpetuating the language. I am not present concerned what becomes of the language, abstractly considered, nor designed to say anything merely to aggrandize or advance its repute. In fact, his letters do reveal Griffith Jones as warmly favouring his native language. He forestalled all secondary argument by immediately appealing to the urgent necessity for the Welsh to hear the gospel message of peace in their own language. This was an unanswerable argument, bound to weigh with the Christian convictions of the pious English supporters of his school. Pleased to consider the weight and importance of saving 400,000 or 500,000, more or less, now living in Wales, and their future descendants. Bringing a knowledge of salvation as contained in the teachings of the Church of England to the population was indeed an overriding aim of his supporters of the SPG, the religious societies and charity schools. Griffith Jones's readers were certain to have no will or counter-argument that preaching to the poor Welsh ought to be put off for generations until English should become the common language. What length of time, I may ask? How many 100 years must be allowed for the general attainment of the English and the dying away of the Welsh language? Having by this disarmed the prime English objections to the Welsh linguistic or to Welsh linguistic autonomy, Griffith Jones went on to broach his belief in the positive worth of the language, but he progressed by way of considerations likely to sway the English benefactors. He suggested caution in abolishing the British language, going on to urge the questioner to consider whether there are not some particular advantages designed us by Providence in continuing the use of it. Now, earnest English Bible readers would be very familiar with the account of the splitting up of languages into numerous mutually incomprehensible tongues at the building of the Tower of Babel, and the overweening ambition, pride and overweening ambition are blamed as the motives of the Tower project. In a way, then, Griffith conceded variations in language can be seen as a bad thing. Thus, he attempted to win over doubting Englishmen by the approach of amiable reasonableness. It is readily confessed that the confounding of the languages for the sin and pride of men upon building the Tower of Babel was a sore evil. But he goes on ingeniously to suggest advantages contained in the natural restraints that the barrier of language differences creates. He, that is God, gave no small demonstration of infinite power, wisdom, and goodness in bringing forth good out of these. His temporal judgments are often turned into mercy. From this acceptable point of principle, Jones went on to make an artful list of advantages from the differentiation of languages. Although dismal effects have often arisen from this, because of men's ungovernable passions and various distempers of their mind and want of humility, yet it prevented the generality from agreeing in errors. So plurality of language was a brake on malign human ambitions. He added, and has been an occasion of more laborious and zealous researches for the truth in every point, which produced more intelligent explications and forcible proofs of many doctrines than we could well have expected. So the multiplicity of languages has redoubled defenses of the right. He went on, It has also kept up a religious emulation in the moral life among the contending parties, who otherwise would be very probably have grown more remiss. So an element of competition has been stimulated by it. He linked his defense of Welsh to the guarding through history of a body of divine revelation, a telling point with his readers. And what is more remarkable, kind providence made these disagreeing parties guards and watchers upon one another, not only to secure the whole body of religion, that no part should be lost, but likewise to preserve the Holy Scripture, sound and whole. Griffith Jones thus based his argument upon the important biblical doctrine of providence, a very persuasive point with his pious donors. Same kind and favourable providence may easily be seen in the confusion of tongues in the literal sense of it. If this had not befallen mankind, perhaps worse consequences would have followed. Now, by this point, he seems confident of having raised persuasive arguments with his pious doubters. At the time, the doctrine of divine providence was being contested in the deistic controversy. He now felt able to cap his reasoning with a rhetorical question. May we not therefore justly fear, when we attempt to abolish a language, that we may fight against the decrees of heaven and seek to undermine the disposals of divine providence? He thinks he's getting them into a corner here. He seems here to have felt that he's put forward some powerful reasons for caution about removing Welsh. And so his advocacy went on more boldly to suggest positive advantages. Question: wherein is the benefit of retaining the Welsh tongue? Answer: if all of us spoke the same tongue with you, the common and labouring people would soon desert their callings in low life here and seek abroad for better preferments in English countries, as many of those brought up in English charity schools are observed to aspire above their station. And then hands would be much wanted here to cultivate our grounds for the necessary support of life, to the great and speedy impoverishment of the whole principality. This argument is not likely to be convincing for us, but though far-fetched, it did touch on serious concerns at the time about the stability of a society depending on everyone's keeping submissively to his appointed station. He continued to write on the absence of bad literature in Welsh. Contemporary moralists were worried about the effect upon people's reading, not novels. I hope nobody in here reads novels. Some saw it as subversive, the post-1660 flow of literature defying the received views, which are based on an assumption of authority in the Bible and on Christian traditions. I'll miss out some of these quotations. I'm sure you're enjoying my attempt to sound like Griffith, but I'm watching the time. He argued further, it is therefore no inconsiderable advantage that our language has so great a protection and defence to our common people against growing corruption of the times in the English tongue, by which means they are less prejudiced and better disposed to receive divine instructions. Thus, by keeping to their language, the Welsh were alleged likely to remain more receptive to helpful influences such as Griffith Jones' own preaching. So keeping the integrity of pure, polished Welsh provided the people with a suitable basis of thought and instruction. But the experience of a mongrel mixture resulting from contact with English was deleterious, he said. This, and worse than this, is the case with those who live in our few English towns here who cannot properly speak it, be said to know any language at all, when they've lost their Welsh, none to understand the word of God in. But he was not arguing that the added knowledge of English would be bad or impossible for Welsh charity school pupils. Sure I am. The Welsh charity schools do in no way hinder to learn English, but do very much contribute towards it. In favour of a policy of treating English as a useful second language for Welsh speakers, Griffith Jones brought out a common sense fact, still not grasped by many English monoglots. Acquaintance with one language does not preclude the learning and use of another. Multilingualism, I'm not making a dig at people that are not specialists in language, please excuse me. Multilingualism is in fact a common human practice. To be able to read, oh, this is now Griffith, to be able to read one language does not increase the difficulty of learning another, but always renders it easier. Well, of course it. You see, these poor old English, one obstacle is removed after another. They got nowhere to hide. Jones returned to the impracticability of replacing Welsh by English. He proceeded to prove that even assuming that there were no benefits from using Welsh, the imposition of English would meet with great difficulties. He presented the man who proposes abolishing Welsh with a heap of obstacles, easily bringing him to a nonplussed standstill. In the acknowledgement of this baffling perplexity, Griffith makes doing nothing seem the only sensible way. Admitting the no convenience, he attended a discontinuing of the Welsh tongue, and it may be desirable all men spoke English, yet to bring this about is hardly practicable. Griffith chose strengthening his point by citing the fact that great damage to the Church of England in Wales had been done by clergymen preaching and ministering in English to uncomprehending congregations of Welsh people. Clergy had not learned Welsh, nor the people English. The result could be utterly harmful. Also exploited the example of Roman Catholicism, which showed greater practicality despite its use in the services of the ancient imperial tongue, unknown to most of its hearers. And he points out that the Pope ordains that preaching be in the known tongue throughout his provinces, despite the use of Latin. Preaching, where there was to be. Jones emphasizes Jones's emphatic reasoning seems alarmist and perhaps exaggerated, but the issue was crucial. He added to his pleas a shaming comparison with Roman Catholicism, the feared rival of English Protestantism. Even that church showed greater wisdom despite using the dead language in its services. And the inept approach in Wales of teaching through the English language typified the overall failure of Protestantism to fulfill its calling in the world at large, and the Danish Lutheran mission at Tranquebar in India, to which Griffith was thinking of going earlier on, being a petty exception. Rushing on the finance of all this, returning to his very successful Welsh language schools, he brought forth a convincing argument of the financial disadvantages of a change. Should these be turned into English charity schools to propagate the language, let it be considered that there are no certain funds, no annuities to defray the expense for them for 1 year. And if there was a certain support for them, it should be considered how much less would be the benefit of them in English than now it is in Welsh. So it's much cheaper to, that if you're going to teach the English in English, then you won't be able to teach so many people. For the same money, there could be but one taught to read English for 12 that are now taught Welsh. In Jones's time, antiquarianism in linguistics and other branches of study had a strong place in educated thought. The work of Edward Llwyd represented a growing field of interest. The idea that Welsh especially was a remainder from the remote past had a strong appeal. as though it had not changed like other languages. The greatest philologists of England and France have maintained that to be the chief remains of the Celtic, which was spoken in Wales, Cornwall, and Basse-Bretagne. Also attempting to win over his educated readers to the preservation of Welsh as a unique piece of archaeology, with the added authority of a revered cleric and a sanction of God's purpose in providence, he wrote, "I cannot omit what is asserted by the learned Dr. Gibson, the present Bishop of London." And then he quotes him as, this would be very telling, a famous Bishop of London, who was something of a philologist of the language, going right back to the ancient Britons and even before Rome. Griffith Jones had to deal with the counterweight of the ignorance and linguistic naivety, even among some of his contemporary, having the contemporary education in the classics, against the sound of the ear, in the ears of the unacquainted, or the alleged difficulty of learning it. He wrote, "Some indeed have complained of its being harsh and rough. It may be so to such as have no mind to learn it." Perhaps he exaggerated the simplicity of Welsh grammar, but another telling point with his readers would be his stress on the similarities with Hebrew, which are not imaginary. One must remember that at the time, Hebrew also was a standard requirement for any scholar, along with Latin and Greek. Its grammar rules are easy, exact, and less in number than are incident to many languages. The Hebrew, to which it is nearly related. Let who pleases compare the Welsh and Hebrew Old Testaments with this view, and he will be surprised at the great number of words and expressions he will observe. And he goes on about that, taking Welsh right back to Hebrew right at the beginning. And his recommendatory pertinence of the real qualities of existing literature in Welsh were also mentioned: a better translation than common of the Holy Bible, and the public worship of God therein in any other language. We have also several sound authors in divinity and tracts of divine poems. And this recommendatory appurtenance of Welsh was given more value where it derived from past ages, nor is it destitute of many monuments of antiquity. Considerable numbers of manuscripts of ancient dates do still remain. Where shall we so properly search, says Mr. Camden, as in our British language, which is so pure, unmixed, and extremely ancient? Gathering up his exhaustive store of defences to the use of Welsh, Griffith Jones suggested that the hand of Providence has preserved the language right until his own time and must be allowed to remain until the end of time. Let it suffice that so great a part of her dominions have been usurped from her, but let no violence be offered to her life. Let her stay the appointed time to expire a peaceful and natural death, which we trust will not be till the consummation of all things. He felt clear enough now to state his frank wish to establish your opinion in favour of our Welsh language. Typical of his inability to omit the smallest point in the exposition of a text, it occurs to Griffith Jones to add the practicality to principle by warning against the presumption of a possible change of English language school to Welsh would be easy. That to exchange the Welsh for the English tongue is feasible, and that no insuperable difficulties would attend it. But in seeking thus to make the use of Welsh a special case amongst other domestic languages, Jones offered a pill too hard probably for most of us to swallow, contriving the elimination of those languages which I in fact I already mentioned. The argument, one further argument from history, is that the Welsh had cooperated loyally within the Tudor state and church despite their different language. ever since Henry VII, kings of England have found us to be of untainted loyalty and obedience. Are we not your fellow members of the same mystical and political body? There was a strong moral persuasion in Griffith Jones's including the English benefactors with the schools and their pupils in a joint cultural and spiritual adventure with the Welsh language as its matrix. He says, gifts and graces not properly used fade or vanish, but if we traffic well with a few talents, we shall soon be trusted with more. And probably we can all consent the idea of trafficking well with all benefits, particularly with that superb cultural instrument, the Welsh language, and of encouraging English friends to feel part of the movement. Griffith Jones summed up by expressing his thanks and thanks of others to that great generosity of these people. And if Griffith Jones were here, we I think would want to join thanking him for what he did for Welsh culture.